They can have the house, I said calmly at my husband's will reading, and my son actually smiled before the lawyer finished the sentence. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and burnt coffee, the kind that sits too long on a warmer, and I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt for a morning that was about to divide my life into before and after. Thomas had been gone for 12 days. 12 quiet, echoing days in a house we had shared for 42 years. I wore navy, the same color I wore to his funeral, and folded my hands neatly in my lap while Daniel and his wife Rachel sat across from me, shoulders almost touching, their expressions carefully composed but unable to hide the anticipation flickering behind their eyes. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and began reading in a steady, professional tone, outlining the charitable donations, the investment accounts, the antique car Thomas had restored in our garage when Daniel was still in high school. Rachel nodded politely at the mention of the donations, but when the word residence finally came up, I saw her straighten just slightly, like a runner hearing the starting gun. The house. The 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Ridge Drive with the wraparound porch Thomas had insisted on building himself every Saturday for an entire summer. The house with the oak floors we refinished after Daniel spilled red paint during a middle school project. The house Rachel had once called a bit outdated when she first married into our family. I give the residence at 214 Maple Ridge Drive to my son Daniel Whitmore. Mr. Collins read and Daniel exhaled long and satisfied, as if he had been holding his breath for weeks. Rachel reached for his hand under the table. They did not look at me. They didn't need to. They already believed they understood my place in this story. A widow at 72. Too old to manage a property tax bill. Too sentimental to fight. I tilted my head slightly and kept my voice even. They can have the house, I repeated, as if I were offering them a second helping of dessert at Sunday dinner. Rachel's lips curved upward. Daniel finally glanced at me, something like relief washing over his face. Perhaps he had expected resistance. Perhaps he had prepared arguments about maintenance costs and safety and how it would be better for me to move into something smaller, something easier, something out of the way. What they did not know was that Thomas and I had spent the last 6 months of his life having conversations they were never invited into. Quiet conversations at the kitchen table long after Daniel and Rachel had driven back to their newer, larger home across town. Conversations about loyalty, about gratitude, about the way certain people reveal themselves when they believe a finish line is near. Mr. Collins cleared his throat and continued reading, unaware that the temperature in the room had shifted by a single degree. However, he said, and the word hung there, small but heavy. Rachel's fingers tightened around Daniel's. I watched the movement the way I used to watch thunderstorms roll in over the backyard. Curious, patient, never afraid. The clause Thomas had added was only one sentence long. One careful, deliberate sentence drafted 3 weeks before he passed, after Daniel had suggested, in what he thought was a private phone call, that it might be time to think about maximizing the property's value. He hadn't known I was in the hallway. He hadn't known I heard Rachel laugh softly and say, "Once it's ours, we can list it by spring." I did not confront them then. I did not cry. I did not accuse. I made tea instead and brought it into the living room like always. Now, in that quiet office, Mr. Collins reached the final line attached to the house. He paused. His eyes moved back across the page just once, as if confirming he had read it correctly. The confidence drained from Rachel's posture almost imperceptibly. Daniel leaned forward. I kept my hands folded, my back straight, my expression unchanged. Grief had already taken the loudest thing from my life. I had no intention of raising my voice to compete with it. They believed inheritance was a reward for waiting. They believed patience entitled them to possession. They believed that by simply surviving Thomas they had won something. What they never considered was that Thomas had been watching, even from his hospital bed, the way Rachel asked about square footage before asking about his pain levels, the way Daniel avoided conversations about my future but eagerly discussed market trends. They can have the house, I had said, and I meant it. I was never attached to wood and brick. I was attached to truth. And as Mr. Collins inhaled to read that final sentence aloud, I realized something surprising. I was not angry. I was not bitter. I was simply finished pretending not to see what had been in front of me all along. They thought I was surrendering. They thought kindness meant weakness. They thought grief had made me fragile. They were wrong. Daniel followed me into the parking lot after the meeting, the late morning sun reflecting off the windshield of his silver sedan, and for a moment he looked less like a confident heir and more like the boy who used to wait for me outside his elementary school with his backpack hanging crookedly off one shoulder. "Mom, why would Dad do that?" he asked, keeping his voice low as Rachel lingered a few steps behind, pretending to scroll through her phone while clearly listening to every word. I adjusted the strap of my purse and looked at him carefully, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm I had earned over decades of swallowing smaller disappointments. "Your father believed in clarity," I said. "He did not like misunderstandings." Daniel frowned. "You think we would force you out?" The question sounded rehearsed, almost offended, yet underneath it I heard something else, something defensive. I remembered the evening 3 months before Thomas passed, when Daniel and Rachel had come over with takeout containers and polite smiles. Rachel had walked through the living room slowly, her fingertips brushing the crown molding Thomas had installed himself. She had asked about the square footage again, then casually mentioned how quickly homes in our neighborhood were appreciating. Daniel had spoken about investment opportunities, about how timing was everything in real estate. At the time, Thomas had listened without interrupting, nodding thoughtfully, but later that night in our bedroom, he had stared at the ceiling for a long time before saying, "They are planning a future that does not include you in this house." I had told him he was being too sensitive. I had defended them. I had always defended them. Standing in that parking lot, I finally understood that Thomas had not been suspicious. He had been observant. Rachel stepped forward then, her expression carefully composed. "Margaret, we only ever wanted what was best for you," she said, her tone smooth, measured, almost rehearsed. I studied her face, the way her eyebrows lifted just slightly at the end of each sentence, inviting agreement. "Of course you did," I replied. "And now what is best for me is exactly what your father arranged." The breeze lifted a strand of my hair across my cheek. Daniel looked at the building behind us as if hoping the documents might somehow revise themselves. "It just complicates things," he muttered. There it was. Not grief. Not concern. Complication. I remembered another moment, one that had seemed harmless at the time. 2 weeks before Thomas entered hospice care, Rachel had offered to help me sort through old paperwork. She had opened drawers with brisk efficiency, stacking documents neatly, occasionally asking which accounts were joint and which were individual. Daniel had stood nearby, silent but attentive. When Thomas later asked what they had been looking for, I told him they were simply being helpful. He had smiled faintly, squeezed my hand and said nothing more. Now I understood that he had already made his decision then. He had called Mr. Collins the next morning. He had scheduled the amendment quietly, without drama, without confrontation. Not to punish Daniel, not to embarrass Rachel, but to draw a line that could not be erased by persuasion. "You will still have the house one day," I said gently, "if you are patient." Rachel's lips pressed together at the word patient. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the asphalt warm beneath our shoes. "We were never trying to rush anything," he insisted. I did not argue. I did not list the comments, the subtle suggestions, the strategic conversations that had led us here. I had learned that explanations rarely change intentions. Instead, I stepped closer and placed my hand briefly on his arm, a gesture that once would have reassured him. "Your father trusted me," I said. "That is all this is." For a moment none of us spoke. Cars passed along the street beyond the lot. Ordinary people moving through an ordinary Thursday, unaware that a family's balance of power had just shifted by a single sentence. Rachel finally broke the silence. "We should get going," she said softly. Daniel nodded, though he did not take his eyes off me until Rachel opened the passenger door. As they drove away, I stood still, watching the car disappear at the end of the block. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel wounded. I felt something steadier than either of those emotions. For years I had mistaken silence for weakness. Thomas had known better. Boundaries do not need volume to be strong. They only need ink and the courage to let them stand. The house felt different when I returned that afternoon, not emptier but clearer, as if something invisible had been rearranged while I was gone. I set my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, The same bowl Thomas brought back from a roadside pottery stand during a summer trip to Vermont 20 years ago, and I stood still for a moment in the foyer. Sunlight filtered through the tall window above the staircase, catching dust particles in a quiet golden drift. For weeks after Thomas passed, every corner of this house had felt heavy with absence. Now it felt anchored. Not by him alone but by intention. I walked into the kitchen and ran my hand along the granite countertop we had saved for 5 years to install. I could still hear his voice the day the contractors finished, joking that it was the most expensive surface we would ever place a coffee mug on. Daniel had been in college then. He had come home that Thanksgiving and told us he planned to major in finance. Thomas had looked proud. I had looked relieved. We believed education would protect him from uncertainty. We did not consider that it might also teach him to measure everything in returns. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had spent countless evenings reviewing bills, planning vacations, discussing Daniel's future. It was at this very table that Thomas had first mentioned changing the will. He had spoken quietly, not angrily, but with a firmness that surprised me. "I want you secure," he had said. "Not tolerated. Secure." At the time I dismissed the distinction. I told him Daniel loved me. I insisted Rachel only sounded practical because she was organized. Thomas had listened without arguing, the way he always did when he had already reached a conclusion. He did not need to win debates. He preferred to prepare quietly. The memory of that conversation returned to me now with sharper edges. I realized how carefully he had observed our family dynamics during his final months. He noticed how Rachel began referring to the house as an asset instead of a home. He noticed how Daniel's visits grew shorter, but his questions about maintenance costs grew more specific. He noticed that when we discussed future holidays, Rachel often suggested hosting at their place instead, citing convenience, parking, or modern appliances. None of it had been dramatic. That was what made it so easy to overlook. I rose from the table and walked into the living room. The framed family photos lined the mantel, capturing stages of our lives that once felt permanent. Daniel at age 8 holding a Little League trophy. Daniel at 22 in his graduation gown. Daniel on his wedding day, Rachel's hand tucked neatly into his arm. I studied that wedding photo for a long moment. Rachel had looked radiant, confident, composed. I had welcomed her sincerely. I had believed that love multiplied when shared. I had not understood that sometimes it shifts direction. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 3 times, steady and unhurried. Time moved forward whether we were ready or not. I sat in Thomas's old armchair, the leather softened by decades of use, and allowed myself to remember his final week in hospice. He had been physically weaker but mentally clear. One evening he asked me to bring him the folder from the desk drawer. I thought he wanted to review insurance paperwork. Instead he showed me the amended clause, already drafted. "You can remove it if you wish," he told me gently. "But I would rather you not have to negotiate your dignity." At the time I had felt embarrassed by the wording. It seemed severe. Now it felt precise. There is a difference between generosity and surrender. I had confused the two for years. As the afternoon light shifted across the hardwood floors, I understood something else as well. Daniel was not my enemy. Rachel was not a villain in the dramatic sense. They were simply people who believed opportunity should be seized when available. They saw timing. Thomas saw character. And I finally saw both. I stood and walked to the front window, looking out at the maple tree we planted the year Daniel was born. Its branches were steady against the autumn sky. The house was still mine to inhabit, not because of walls or deeds, but because of clarity. And clarity, once written into law, does not require raised voices to defend it. The next morning Daniel called before 9 o'clock, which told me more than his words ever could. He has never been an early riser unless something is pressing. I was in the kitchen slicing an apple, the blade moving slowly and evenly against the cutting board, when my phone vibrated against the counter. I let it ring twice before answering. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady. There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he expected something sharper. "Mom, I have been thinking about yesterday," he began carefully. I could picture him standing near the tall windows of his own house, coffee in hand, trying to arrange his tone into something neutral. It feels complicated. He chose that word again. Complicated. I carried my plate to the table and sat down, looking out toward the backyard where the maple leaves had begun to turn a deeper shade of amber. What feels complicated? I asked gently. The house. The conditions. It just seems unnecessary. We would never push you. I took a slow bite of apple before answering, not to provoke him, but to give the silence room to breathe. Your father believed in written promises, I said. He did not want anyone relying on assumptions. Another pause. Then more directly. Rachel feels like this suggests we cannot be trusted. I almost smiled at that. Not out of amusement but recognition. Trust is rarely questioned until boundaries appear. Trust is strengthened by clarity, I replied. Not weakened. I could hear him exhale. He was not used to this version of me. For years I softened everything. If Daniel forgot a birthday, I reminded him gently and pretended it was my oversight. If Rachel suggested changes to holiday traditions, I agreed quickly to avoid tension. I believed flexibility kept families close. Now I understood that constant flexibility slowly erases shape. We were only thinking long-term, Daniel said. About investment. About growth. I let the word growth settle between us. Growth for whom? Growth measured by what? There are different kinds of growth, I answered quietly. Some increase property value. Others reveal character. He did not respond immediately. I imagined him glancing toward Rachel, who was likely listening from across the room. Their house is open concept, modern, efficient. You can hear almost everything from anywhere. So what happens now? He finally asked. There it was. The real question. Not about emotion. About outcome. Now nothing changes, I said. I continue living here. You continue living there. Time moves forward. He sounded dissatisfied. And when you eventually, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I spared him. When that time comes, everything is clear, I said. Until then I expect peace. The word peace felt deliberate. I ended the call without hostility, without raised voices. After I set my phone down, I walked through the house slowly, noticing details I had once overlooked. The slight creak in the third stair from the bottom. The faint scratch on the dining table from when Daniel dragged a science project across it in 8th grade. The framed landscape Thomas painted during his retirement. These were not assets. They were evidence of life. By mid-afternoon Rachel sent a text. It was polite, carefully worded. She suggested coming by over the weekend to talk things through. I read the message twice before replying. Sunday at 2 in the afternoon works. No explanation. No invitation beyond that. If they wished to talk, they would do so in the house they were so eager to plan without me. I spent the rest of the day reorganizing a drawer in the study, sorting old receipts and letters into neat stacks. It was not necessary work, but it felt symbolic. Order matters. When evening settled in and the porch light cast its familiar glow over the front steps, I brewed tea and sat in Thomas's armchair again. I thought about how easily I once mistook anticipation for love. How quickly I excused subtle entitlement as ambition. Boundaries, I realized, are not punishments. They are measurements. And for the first time in years I felt measured on my own terms. Sunday arrived with a quiet gray sky and the faint scent of rain in the air, the kind that lingers without fully committing. At 1:55 in the afternoon I was already seated at the dining table, a pot of coffee warming on the counter and 3 cups placed neatly on their saucers. I had chosen the dining room deliberately. It was formal without being hostile, familiar without being sentimental. At exactly 2 o'clock the doorbell rang. I did not rush. I walked to the front door at an even pace, and opened it to find Daniel standing straight-backed and Rachel offering a measured smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Come in, I said simply. They stepped inside and I noticed Rachel's gaze sweep across the foyer, the staircase, the framed photographs, as if assessing changes. There were none. We sat at the table. I poured coffee for all 3 of us, the steady sound of liquid filling porcelain carrying more weight than small talk ever could. Daniel cleared his throat first. Mom, we have been thinking, he began, hands clasped together on the table. Rachel nodded in agreement, her posture composed. We just want to make sure everyone feels secure, she added. The word secure hung between us. I recognized it immediately. It was the same word Thomas had used months ago, though his tone had been protective, not strategic. I feel secure, I replied calmly. That was your father's intention. Rachel leaned slightly forward. Of course. We just believe it might be more efficient if we discussed long-term planning together. Taxes. Maintenance. Future improvements. Improvements. I looked down at the polished surface of the table Thomas refinished by hand one winter when Daniel was away at college. The wood held faint marks of family dinners, science projects, holiday centerpieces. The house does not require improvement, I said gently. It requires care. Daniel shifted in his chair. You are 72, Mom. We are only thinking ahead. His tone remained controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now. Not anger. Impatience. I folded my hands in front of me, mirroring the posture I had adopted in the lawyer's office days earlier. Thinking ahead is wise, I agreed. Assuming ahead is not. Rachel inhaled slowly, as if steadying herself. No one is assuming anything, she said. We just want clarity. I almost admired the precision of her language. Clarity is already written, I answered. There is no confusion. For a moment none of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt longer than usual. Daniel finally leaned back, exhaling through his nose. It feels like you do not trust us, he said. I met his eyes. Trust does not disappear because boundaries exist, I replied. It reveals itself. The silence that followed was different from the one at the lawyer's office. That silence had been shock. This one was adjustment. Rachel set her cup down carefully. We are family, she said. I nodded. Yes. And families thrive on respect. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. I could see Daniel recalculating again, weighing options, measuring tone, considering whether pushing further would activate the very clause they wished did not exist. The document had done more than protect property. It had created space. Space for me to speak without apology. Space for them to recognize that patience is not the same as weakness. We only wanted to make sure you would not feel overwhelmed, Daniel said at last, his tone softer now. I am not overwhelmed, I answered. I am aware. Rachel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Awareness is harder to negotiate with than emotion. After a few more strained but civil exchanges about landscaping and property taxes, the conversation began to wind down. They stood to leave, both composed but quieter than when they arrived. At the door Daniel hesitated. We will give you time, he said. I offered a small steady smile. Time was never yours to give, I replied, not unkindly. When the door closed behind them, the house settled back into its familiar rhythm. I walked through the living room, past the photographs and the grandfather clock, and felt no surge of triumph, no lingering resentment. Only steadiness. They had come expecting negotiation. They left with understanding. And understanding, unlike inheritance, cannot be transferred by force. The week that followed moved quietly, almost deceptively so. Daniel did not call. Rachel did not send carefully worded messages about long-term planning. The silence between us was not hostile, but it was deliberate. I understood what it meant. They were reassessing. I continued my routines as usual. I walked to the mailbox each morning at 9:30. I watered the maple tree in the backyard even though autumn had already begun to cool the soil. I reviewed the monthly statements at the kitchen table with the same methodical care Thomas once used. Life, when left undisturbed, has a rhythm that steadies the mind. On Wednesday afternoon I received a call from Mr. Collins. His tone was neutral, professional. Margaret, he said. Daniel reached out with a few procedural questions regarding the occupancy clause. I did not feel surprised. I had expected curiosity to evolve into inquiry. And I asked calmly. He wanted clarification about what might constitute pressure or coercion under the language of the document. I paused briefly, considering the precision of that question. It was not about selling the house. It was about limits. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him the wording is intentionally broad, Mr. Collins replied. Any attempt to persuade you to vacate against your comfort could legally activate the alternate distribution. I could almost see Daniel's expression upon hearing that. Not anger. Calculation again. Always calculation. After I ended the call, I remained seated in the study, looking at the framed photograph of Thomas on his retirement day. He had worn a navy suit and a small satisfied smile, the kind that comes from building something solid over time. He believed in foundations, not appearances. That evening, just before sunset, Daniel appeared at the front door without calling ahead. I opened it to find him alone. No Rachel. His hands were empty. No folder. No paperwork. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him enter. We sat in the living room, the late light casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. He did not begin immediately. Instead he looked around, really looked, as though noticing details he had once overlooked. "I used to sit right there," he said quietly, pointing to the spot near the fireplace where he built block towers as a child. I nodded. "You did." He exhaled slowly. I guess I did not realize how fast things were moving in my head. The honesty surprised me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was unguarded. "Moving toward what?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "Toward the future. Toward what comes next." I studied his face, searching for the boy I once held on my hip while Thomas grilled hamburgers on the back porch. He was still there, buried beneath ambition and planning and the pressure of building his own life. "The future is not something you seize," I said quietly. "It arrives." He nodded, eyes lowered. "Rachel worries about stability," he admitted. "She grew up without much." There it was. Context. Not excuse, but context. "Stability does not come from ownership," I replied. "It comes from conduct." He looked up at me then, and for the first time since the will reading, there was no calculation in his expression, only reflection. "Did you think I would push you out?" he asked softly. I did not answer. Immediately, I allowed the silence to settle between us like a measured breath. "I thought you were thinking ahead without looking beside you," I said at last. He absorbed that. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, marking the hour without urgency. "I do not want to lose you over a house," he said. I almost smiled. "Then do not treat it like one," I answered. He stayed another 20 minutes. We did not discuss legal clauses. We did not revisit the language of the document. Instead we spoke about ordinary things. The maple tree. The car that still sat in the garage. The way the porch light flickers in heavy rain. When he finally stood to leave, his shoulders seemed lighter, though not carefree. Understanding does not erase consequence. It simply reframes it. After he drove away, I stood at the front window watching the taillights disappear down Maple Ridge Drive. The house remained quiet, steady, unchanged. Boundaries had not broken my family. They had revealed its fault lines. And now, at least, those lines were visible to all of us. The following Saturday Rachel came alone. I could see her car pull into the driveway just after noon, the engine idling for a moment before she stepped out, smoothing the front of her coat as if preparing for a presentation rather than a visit. I opened the door before she rang the bell. "Margaret," she said with a polite nod, her voice even but tight at the edges. I stepped aside and let her in. The house felt calm, almost observant. She followed me into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room not with appraisal this time, but with caution. I poured 2 glasses of water instead of coffee. The tone of the conversation did not require warmth. "Daniel told me you spoke," she began, sitting upright at the table. "He said things are clear now." I took my seat across from her and folded my hands lightly. "They are," I replied. She studied my face as though searching for sarcasm and finding none. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," she said carefully. "We were thinking practically. We did not mean to appear opportunistic." The word lingered between us. I appreciated that she chose it herself. "Appearances are shaped by timing," I answered quietly. "When timing aligns too closely with expectation, people notice." She inhaled slowly, her composure slipping just slightly. "I grew up watching my parents lose everything," she said, her voice lower now. "I promised myself I would never be unprepared." For the first time I heard something unguarded in her tone. Not manipulation. Not strategy. Fear. Preparation is wise, I said. But it must not erase empathy. She looked down at her hands. We did not mean to make you feel displaced. The word displaced echoed in my mind. That had been the sensation, subtle and creeping, long before Thomas amended the document. Displaced inside my own kitchen. Displaced in conversations about the future. Intent and impact are not always the same, I replied. Silence settled for a moment. Outside, a breeze stirred the maple leaves against the window. Daniel loves you, she added softly. I know, I said. And love is not measured by inheritance. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and for once there was no calculation in them, only recognition. The clause felt like a warning, she admitted. I considered that carefully. It was not a threat, I said. It was a reminder. She nodded slowly. A reminder of what? She asked. That patience reveals character, I answered. And that security built at someone else's expense is not security at all. She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. We did not argue. We did not revisit legal phrasing. Instead, we spoke plainly for nearly an hour. She described her childhood apartment with peeling paint and eviction notices taped to the door. I described the years Thomas and I worked overtime to afford this house, the mortgage payments that once felt impossible, the nights we calculated grocery budgets down to the dollar. Stability, I realized, means different things to different people. To her, it meant ownership as quickly as possible. To me, it meant belonging without condition. When she finally stood to leave, her posture was different than when she arrived. Not defeated. Not triumphant. Simply steadier. At the door she paused. I will not pressure you, she said quietly. That was never my intention. I held her gaze, not coldly, not warmly, but honestly. Then there will be no problem, I replied. After she left, I closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment. The house remained unchanged. The walls did not shift. The floors did not creak in protest. But something had settled. Not victory. Not surrender. Understanding. Boundaries had not destroyed our family. They had clarified it. And clarity, once accepted, leaves very little room for pretense. Weeks passed, and the house settled into a quieter rhythm than it had known in years. Daniel still visited, though now he knocked before entering, even when he knew I was home. Rachel came with him more often than before, not to discuss property values or long-term strategies, but to sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee while we spoke about ordinary things. The shift was subtle, almost invisible to anyone outside our walls, yet unmistakable to me. The urgency was gone. In its place was something steadier. One afternoon in late October, Daniel stood beside me in the backyard, looking up at the maple tree whose branches had turned a deep shade of red. I never realized how much work you and Dad put into this place, he said quietly. I handed him the rake and watched him begin gathering fallen leaves into careful piles. We did not build it quickly, I replied. That is why it lasted. He nodded, pushing the rake through the grass with slow, deliberate strokes. I saw in that movement not ambition but reflection. Rachel joined us later with a thermos of hot cider. She did not mention square footage. She did not calculate curb appeal. She simply stood beside Daniel, her coat brushing his sleeve, and asked if I needed help storing the patio furniture before winter. The request was simple, but the tone carried something new. Not assumption. Not entitlement. Consideration. That evening we sat on the back porch as the sun lowered behind the trees. The air had grown cooler, sharp enough to remind us that seasons change whether we resist them or not. Daniel looked at me with a seriousness that felt earned. I am glad Dad wrote it the way he did, he said. Rachel glanced at him, then at me, and nodded once in agreement. I did not answer immediately. I let the quiet stretch between us, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Your father believed people show who they are when given opportunity, I said at last. He wanted everyone to have the chance to choose well. Daniel exhaled slowly. And if we had not? He asked. I met his gaze steadily. Then the document would have chosen for you. He absorbed that without argument. The truth, when delivered without accusation, rarely requires defense. As winter approached, the conversations about the house shifted entirely. Instead of discussing when it might be sold, we discussed how to preserve it. Daniel repaired the loose step on the porch one Saturday morning. Rachel brought new curtains for the guest room, asking first if I liked the fabric. I did not mistake these gestures for repayment. They were not transactions. They were adjustments. Boundaries had not created distance. They had created awareness. On the first snowfall of December, I stood by the front window watching flakes settle softly along Maple Ridge Drive. The street looked unchanged, yet everything felt steadier. Thomas had not written that clause to punish. He had written it to reveal. And in revealing, it had done something unexpected. It had given Daniel and Rachel the opportunity to reconsider not only their expectations, but their priorities. Later that evening, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, his voice calm and sincere. "When the time comes, we will be ready. But until then, this is your home." I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words settle. "It has always been," I replied. After we ended the call, I walked through the quiet rooms, touching the back of the dining chair, the edge of the mantel, the smooth railing along the staircase. The house no longer felt like an asset waiting to be claimed. It felt like what it had always been. A foundation built with intention. They had wanted security. They had wanted certainty. They had wanted the house. In the end, they received exactly what was written for them. And what was written was not ownership, but understanding.